There are moments that divide your life into before and after. This was mine. I remember the sound first. A soft creak, barely audible above the rain that had been falling since dinner. The kind of sound an old house makes when it settles, when wood expands and contracts with the coastal dampness that seeps into everything here. But this creak was different. Deliberate. Human. The digital clock on my nightstand cast its pale green glow across the darkness. 3:14 in the morning. I had been dreaming of something I couldn't quite remember, something that left me feeling hollow and restless even in sleep. The rain was steady against the windows, not violent but persistent, the way grief settles into your bones and refuses to leave. I lay still, listening. The guest room door across the hall had been ajar when I went to bed, exactly as I had left it that evening, prepared but unused. The sheets I had turned down with such careful precision remained untouched, the towels I had folded and placed on the dresser still in their neat stack. He had chosen not to sleep there, though I never asked him why. In the 3 days since he had arrived with his single suitcase and that look of profound emptiness, Andre had wandered my house like a ghost revisiting scenes of an unfinished life. We had barely spoken since Mia's funeral 2 weeks ago. A few words exchanged in the kitchen. Polite acknowledgments when we passed in the hallway. The careful dance of two people who once knew each other completely and now felt like strangers sharing the same air. But in that moment, in the darkness of my bedroom, I felt the mattress shift. The movement was so subtle I might have imagined it, but then there was the whisper of fabric against sheets, the slight displacement of weight that told me I was no longer alone. My heart began to race, each beat so loud I was certain he could hear it in the silence between us. Andre slipped under the covers beside me without a word. No explanation, no request for permission, just the simple, devastating act of choosing to be close. I could feel the warmth of his body, even though we weren't touching, could sense the careful way he positioned himself to leave space between us while still sharing the same small island of mattress and blankets. I had forgotten how to breathe properly. His presence filled the darkness like a familiar song you haven't heard in years, but somehow still know by heart. There was the scent of his shampoo, that same brand he had used since we were teenagers. Cypress and smoke, and something indefinably him that took me back to boarding school dormitories and whispered conversations after lights out. 23 years had passed since those nights, but my body remembered everything my mind had tried so hard to forget. We lay there in the rain-soaked darkness, two grown men pretending to sleep while the space between us hummed with everything we had never said. I could hear the careful rhythm of his breathing, could feel the slight tremor in the mattress when he shifted position. He was as awake as I was, as aware of the electric tension that had suddenly filled the room. I thought about the boy he had been, golden-haired and fearless, always the first to dive into the lake behind the chapel, always ready with a joke to break the heavy silences that settled over our dormitory like fog. The boy who had shared his contraband snacks and covered for me when I was caught drawing instead of studying Latin. The boy who had looked at me sometimes with an expression I had never quite understood but had memorized anyway, filed away in the secret corners of my heart. This was not that boy. This was a man hollowed out by loss, carrying the weight of a funeral and two confused children and a life that had been suddenly, irrevocably altered. But underneath the grief and the years that had passed between us, something familiar stirred. Something I had convinced myself was better left buried. Nothing happened that night. We didn't speak. We didn't touch. We simply existed in the same space, breathing the same air, listening to the same rain against the same windows. But everything changed. The careful distance I had maintained, the walls I had built to keep the past safely contained, began to crack. By morning, I knew that the week he had planned to stay would not be nearly long enough. Not for him to heal, and not for me to figure out what it meant that he had chosen my bed over the perfectly prepared guest room. What it meant that after all these years, he had come to me. The rain continued to fall, and I lay awake until dawn, memorizing the sound of his breathing and wondering if I was brave enough to let myself hope for something I had given up on a lifetime ago. I am 41 years old, and I have spent most of my adult life perfecting the art of being invisible. My house sits on a bluff overlooking the Atlantic, 3 miles outside the center of town where the tourists stop coming and the locals know better than to ask too many questions. It's a weathered Victorian that my mother left me when she died 5 years ago, along with her collection of china teacups and the persistent smell of lavender that still clings to the curtains in the front parlor. The sea air here ages everything prematurely. Paint peels and salt-kissed curls. Metal rusts overnight. Wood warps and settles in ways that create the symphony of creaks and sighs that old houses make when they think no one is listening. It's the perfect place for someone like me, someone who restores damaged things for a living and prefers the company of objects that can't ask uncomfortable questions about why I live alone. I work from the converted sunroom at the back of the house, where the northern light is perfect for seeing the true colors beneath centuries of grime and overpaint. Renaissance angels emerge from darkened canvases under my patient hands. Cracked varnish gives way to luminous flesh tones that have been hidden for decades. I coax beauty back to life, one careful stroke at a time. It's precise work that requires steady hands and infinite patience. The kind of work that suits a man who has learned to find satisfaction in small, controlled improvements rather than grand gestures or dramatic changes. I take damaged things and make them whole again, but I never add anything that wasn't already there. I simply reveal what was always meant to be seen. My days follow a rhythm as predictable as the tides. Tea at dusk, always Earl Grey in the blue cup my mother favored. Classical vinyl on weekends, Brahms or Chopin filling the empty rooms with something that feels like company but makes no demands. And beneath my bed, wrapped in an old pillowcase, a journal filled with letters I have written but never sent. Letters to editors of art magazines who might be interested in my work. Letters to distant cousins who send Christmas cards but never visit. Letters to Andre. I have been writing to Andre for 23 years, long conversations on paper that he will never read. Letters that begin with careful updates about my life and invariably spiral into confessions I could never speak aloud. I tell him about the paintings I've restored, the books I've read, the way the light changes over the ocean in winter. I tell him about the loneliness that sits in my chest like a stone, about the dreams where we are 17 again and anything still seems possible. I am not out, not in any way that matters. There's no closet door to open because I have never acknowledged that there was one to begin with. I simply exist in the spaces between definitions, absent from conversations about dating and marriage and the normal milestones that mark a life lived in full view of others. The people in town know me as the quiet man who fixes old paintings, who nods politely at the grocery store and pays his bills on time and never causes any trouble. It's a safe kind of invisibility, but it's also a prison I built for myself one careful brick at a time. Andre was never invisible. Even at 14, when we first met in the hallways of St. Augustine Preparatory, he moved through the world like someone who had never doubted his right to take up space. Golden-haired and quick to laugh, he collected friends the way other boys collected baseball cards. He was everything I was not: confident, athletic, unafraid of being seen. We were roommates by chance that first year, thrown together by an alphabetical lottery that paired Desmond Hartwell with Andre Harrison. I expected to be overlooked, relegated to the role of the quiet boy who kept his head down and caused no problems. Instead, Andre seemed genuinely interested in the careful sketches I made during study hall, in the way I could identify the artist of any painting in our art history textbooks without looking at the caption. He called me Des, a nickname that made my given name feel less formal, less like something my mother had chosen from a book of saints. He shared his care packages from home, sneaking cookies and dried fruit into our room after lights out. When I was caught drawing portraits of our Latin teacher instead of declining verbs, Andre claimed he had commissioned the artwork, taking detention alongside me with a grin that suggested he found the whole thing amusing rather than shameful. For 4 years, we were inseparable. We spent summers at his family's house in the Berkshires, swimming in the lake and reading under the old oak tree that grew beside the dock. We shared everything: books, music, the kind of dreams that teenage boys whisper in the dark when they think the world isn't listening. He wanted to be a journalist, to travel and write about places that existed only in National Geographic magazines. I wanted to study art, to spend my life surrounded by beautiful things that had survived long enough to tell their stories. But something changed our senior year. Maybe it was the way he started talking about Sarah Morrison, the girl from the sister school who wrote him letters that smelled like perfume. Maybe it was the night we almost kissed in the art room after working late on a project, the moment when everything shifted and neither of us knew how to shift it back. Maybe it was simply the approaching reality of graduation, the knowledge that whatever we had built together in the safe confines of school would not survive in the wider world. I pulled away. Not dramatically, not with explanations or arguments, but gradually, like a tide retreating so slowly you don't notice until the beach is bare. I started spending more time alone, taking long walks around the campus perimeter instead of joining Andre and his friends in the common room. I stopped sharing my sketches, stopped accepting his invitations to weekend trips home. I built walls so carefully that even I didn't realize I was constructing them until it was too late to tear them down. Andre tried, at first. He asked if something was wrong, if he had done something to upset me. But I had become an expert at deflection, at smiling and claiming everything was fine while slowly erasing myself from his life. By graduation, we were polite strangers, two boys who had once shared everything now struggling to find anything to say to each other. He married Sarah Morrison 3 years later. I learned about it from a wedding announcement in the alumni newsletter, a small paragraph that included a photo of Andre in a tuxedo, grinning at the camera with the same easy confidence he had possessed at 14. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl whose school photos Andre occasionally shared on social media. He became a real estate agent in a suburb outside Hartford, selling houses to families who looked exactly like the one he had created for himself. I followed his life from a distance, through carefully managed glimpses on the internet and updates from mutual acquaintances who had no idea they were delivering intelligence about the only person who had ever mattered to me. He looked happy in the photos, surrounded by the noise and chaos of a full life. Everything I had convinced myself I didn't want. Mia died on a Tuesday morning in March. A heart attack at 38, sudden and merciless. I learned about it from an obituary that a former classmate shared, along with expressions of shock and sympathy that felt inadequate in the face of such loss. The funeral was on a Friday. I drove 3 hours to attend, sitting in the back of the church where Andre wouldn't see me, watching him hold his children's hands while they lowered his wife into the ground. He called me 2 weeks later. I hadn't heard his voice in over 20 years, but I recognized it immediately, though it was rougher now, hollowed out by grief. He said he had gotten my number from the alumni directory. He said he needed to get away for a while, that his sister-in-law was taking care of the kids, and he just needed some space to figure out how to breathe again. He asked if he could stay with me for a week. Just a week, he promised, as if he thought I might refuse. I said yes before I could think about what it would mean to have him in my carefully ordered life, before I could consider the implications of sharing space with the person who had shaped every definition I had of love and loss and the ache of wanting something you can never have. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with a single suitcase and eyes that looked like he had been staring into some unbearable brightness for too long. We hugged awkwardly in my front hallway. 2 middle-aged men who had once known each other's heartbeats trying to remember how to touch without breaking something precious. And now, 3 days later, he was lying in my bed in the dark hours before dawn, close enough to touch, but still impossibly far away. Still Andre, but also not Andre. Still the boy who had once made me believe in possibilities, now weighted down by realities I couldn't begin to understand. I closed my eyes and listened to him breathe, wondering what it meant that after all these years, when his life had fallen apart, he had chosen to come to me. When Andre stepped out of his rental car that Tuesday afternoon, the first thing I noticed was how much smaller he seemed. Not physically diminished, but somehow compressed, as if grief had taught him to take up less space in the world. He stood in my driveway for a long moment, looking up at the house with an expression I couldn't read, his single black suitcase sitting beside him like a faithful dog. I had been watching from the kitchen window, my hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold while I waited. I had changed my shirt twice that morning, straightened books that were already perfectly aligned, vacuumed rooms that didn't need cleaning. 23 years of separation, and I was still trying to make myself worthy of his attention. Our embrace in the front hallway was a careful thing. Two men who had once known each other's bodies as extensions of their own, now navigating the foreign territory of middle-aged grief and regret. His arms felt different around me, broader but somehow more fragile, and he smelled like rental car air freshener and the particular exhaustion that comes from not sleeping properly for weeks. "Welcome," I said, and the word felt inadequate in the vast space between what I meant and what I could safely offer. He nodded and picked up his suitcase, following me up the stairs to the guest room I had prepared with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that betrayed how much this moment mattered to me. Fresh flowers on the nightstand, towels folded in perfect thirds, a small basket of toiletries arranged like an offering on the dresser. "This is beautiful," he said, but his voice was hollow, as if beauty was a concept he had temporarily forgotten how to appreciate. The house felt different with him in it from the very first hour. Smaller, somehow, but also more alive. Sounds I had stopped noticing became amplified. The creak of floorboards under footsteps that weren't mine, the whisper of water through pipes when someone else showered, the subtle shift in air pressure when another person moved through rooms that had grown accustomed to solitude. That first evening, we sat across from each other at my dining table, eating the simple pasta I had prepared and making conversation that felt like walking across a frozen pond, testing each step to make sure the ice would hold. He told me about the drive up from Connecticut, about how the kids were doing with their aunt, about practical things that didn't require him to venture into the deeper waters of what he was actually feeling. I listened and offered appropriate responses, but mostly I watched him. The way he pushed food around his plate without really eating. The way his eyes would drift to the windows when the conversation lagged, as if he was expecting someone who would never arrive. The way his hands had developed a slight tremor that he tried to hide by keeping them occupied with his fork or his water glass. We established a rhythm without discussing it, the way people do when they're trying to coexist without acknowledging the complications that hum beneath the surface of ordinary interactions. Mornings began with tea. I would wake before dawn, as I always had, and make enough for two, leaving his mug on the counter where he would find it when he eventually emerged from the guest room. We would drink in companionable silence, standing at opposite ends of the kitchen island, watching the light change over the water through the large windows that faced east. He was not a morning talker, I discovered. Neither was I. This shared preference for quiet felt like a small gift, a reminder that some things about him hadn't changed, that beneath the grief and the years that had transformed us both, the essential Andre still existed. After breakfast, we would walk. The beach path that ran along the bluff was perfect for this kind of aimless wandering, long enough to accommodate an hour of movement without requiring a destination or purpose. The gray shore stretched for miles in both directions, littered with sea glass and driftwood, and the occasional seal that would watch us from the waves with curious, intelligent eyes. Andre talked during these walks, not about anything important, but in the meandering way that people do when movement unlocks something in their minds that sitting still keeps trapped. He told me about houses he had sold, about his daughter's piano recitals and his son's little league games, about the small dramas of suburban life that had filled his days before everything stopped making sense. I listened and offered questions that encouraged him to keep talking, not because I particularly cared about property values or youth sports, but because his voice filled a silence I hadn't realized was so profound until it was broken. And sometimes, when he would pause to examine a particularly interesting shell or watch the gulls dive for fish, I would catch him looking at me with an expression that reminded me of the boy who had once watched me sketch during study hall, as if he was trying to figure out something he couldn't quite name. Lunch was usually simple. Sandwiches eaten standing at the kitchen counter, or soup heated from a can while rain drummed against the windows. The weather had been gray since his arrival, not stormy but persistent in its grayness, the kind of coastal spring that makes you forget what sunshine looks like. Afternoons found us in separate but nearby spaces. I would work in my studio, restoring a 17th-century Madonna whose face had been obscured by centuries of candle smoke and well-meaning but misguided previous restoration attempts. Andre would read in the living room, or sometimes wander into my study, where he would examine the books on my shelves with the careful attention of someone trying to understand who I had become in his absence. My study was the most personal room in the house, lined with art books and auction catalogs and monographs on painters whose work I had spent years learning to understand. There were photographs, too, carefully framed, my parents on their wedding day, the view from my dorm room window at Yale, a few landscapes I had taken during a trip to Italy the summer after graduate school. Andre would spend longer and longer periods in that room each day, and I would find excuses to check on him, bringing him tea or mentioning some book I thought he might find interesting. These interactions were charged with something I couldn't name, but could feel in the way our eyes would meet and hold for just a moment too long, in the careful way we maneuvered around each other in the narrow space between the desk and the bookshelf. One afternoon, I found him holding a small framed photograph I kept on the shelf behind my desk. It was from our senior year at St. Augustine, taken during a school trip to Boston. We were standing in front of the Museum of Fine Arts, both of us squinting in the bright spring sunlight, Andre's arm slung casually over my shoulder in the easy way that teenage boys touch each other before the world teaches them to be careful about such things. I had forgotten I still had this picture, had stopped seeing it years ago the way you stop noticing furniture that has become part of the landscape of your daily life. But watching Andre hold it, studying our 17-year-old faces with something that might have been nostalgia or regret, I felt the weight of everything we had never said to each other settle between us like a stone dropped into still water. He didn't ask about the photograph, and I didn't explain why I had kept it. He simply placed it back on the shelf and commented on something else, some book or artifact that required no emotional archaeology to discuss safely. Dinners were the most difficult part of our routine. By evening, the careful politeness we maintained during the day would begin to fray around the edges, worn thin by hours of proximity and the persistent awareness of all the subjects we were avoiding. We would sit at opposite ends of my dining table, the distance between us feeling both too great and not nearly great enough. He would try to eat, pushing food around his plate with the mechanical motions of someone who had forgotten that food was supposed to provide pleasure as well as sustenance. Sometimes he would manage a few bites. Other times he would give up entirely, apologizing as if his grief was an inconvenience to me. I wanted to reach across the table and take his hand. I wanted to tell him that he didn't need to apologize for being human, for carrying the weight of loss that was still too fresh to bear easily. But the space between us felt charged with too many complications to cross safely. So I would clear his barely touched plate without comment and suggest we might watch something on television, some mindless distraction that would carry us through the remaining hours until we could retreat to our separate rooms. But on the third night, something shifted. We had finished another quiet dinner, another evening of careful conversation that touched on everything except what mattered. Andre had helped me clear the dishes, and in the process of handing me a serving bowl, our fingers had brushed in a way that lasted just a moment longer than necessary. Neither of us acknowledged it, but the touch lingered between us like an echo. I said goodnight first, as I had the previous 2 evenings. He nodded and said he might read for a while longer, might finish the chapter he had started earlier. I climbed the stairs to my bedroom and went through my normal routine, brushing my teeth, changing into pajamas, checking that the doors were locked and the coffee maker was set for morning. But this time, Andre didn't say goodnight from the living room. This time, I didn't hear his footsteps on the stairs followed by the gentle click of the guest room door closing. Instead, I lay in my bed listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around us, waiting for the confirmation that he had gone to his room, that the careful boundaries we had maintained were still intact. The minutes stretched on, marked by the digital clock beside my bed and the steady rhythm of rain against the windows. Then I heard it, the soft creak of the stairs, the whisper of socked feet on the hallway runner. But instead of continuing to the guest room, the footsteps stopped outside my door. For a long moment, there was only silence and the sound of my own heartbeat. Then the door opened, so quietly I might have imagined it if not for the change in the light from the hallway. Andre stepped into my room without speaking, without explanation, without asking permission. In the darkness, I could just make out his silhouette as he moved around the foot of the bed to the other side, lifting the covers and sliding underneath them with the careful precision of someone trying not to wake a sleeper. He lay on his back, turned slightly away from me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body but not touching. His breathing was controlled, deliberate, as if he too was concentrating on the simple act of existing in the same space without crossing the invisible lines that had kept us safe for the past 3 days. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and listening to the rain, my heart beating so loudly I was certain he could hear it in the darkness between us. Everything had changed, but nothing had happened. We were 41 and 42 years old, two men who had loved each other as boys and then spent decades learning how to live with that love carefully buried. And now we were sharing a bed, inches apart but not touching, breathing the same air and pretending to sleep while the world shifted around us in ways neither of us was ready to acknowledge. The next morning, we pretended it hadn't happened. Andre was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, standing at the counter with his mug of tea, watching the gulls wheel and dive beyond the windows. His hair was damp from the shower, and he had changed into fresh clothes, erasing any evidence of the night we had spent lying inches apart in my bed, breathing the same air and pretending to sleep. "Good morning," he said, as if nothing had changed. "Good morning," I replied, and poured my own tea with hands that were steadier than I had any right to expect. We fell back into our established rhythm as if by mutual agreement. The beach walk, the quiet lunch, the afternoon hours spent in separate but nearby rooms. But underneath the familiar routine, something fundamental had shifted. The air between us hummed with a new kind of tension, charged with the knowledge that the careful boundaries we had maintained were more fragile than either of us had pretended. That evening, we shared another quiet dinner, another evening of conversation that danced around the edges of what we were both thinking. And when it came time to say goodnight, Andre didn't make any announcement about reading longer or finishing a chapter. He simply followed me upstairs, as natural as breathing, as if this was how it had always been. He undressed in the darkness while I lay with my back turned, listening to the whisper of fabric and the soft sounds of him settling into bed beside me. The mattress dipped under his weight, and I felt him arrange himself carefully on his side of the bed, close enough to share warmth but not touching. This became our new normal, though we never discussed it. Andre simply stopped using the guest room, and I stopped expecting him to. His things gradually migrated from across the hall. His toothbrush appeared next to mine in the bathroom cup. His reading glasses found a place on the nightstand. A paperback novel lay open on what had become his side of the bed. We were like two people learning a new language together, one that had no words, only the careful grammar of proximity and restraint. We slept with our backs turned toward each other, but each night we seemed to edge closer, drawn by some magnetic force that we were both too afraid to acknowledge directly. The days took on a different quality too. There was an intimacy now in our ordinary interactions that hadn't existed before, a sense of shared conspiracy in the way we moved around each other in the kitchen, the way our eyes would meet across the breakfast table and hold for just a moment longer than necessary. I found myself watching him more carefully, cataloging the small changes that 2 decades had written across his features, the fine lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled, which happened rarely but was devastating when it did. The way his hair had begun to recede slightly at the temples, revealing more of his forehead and making his face seem more open, more vulnerable. The small scar on his chin that I didn't remember from our school days, evidence of some minor accident or adventure that had happened in my absence. He had developed habits I didn't recognize. He would run his thumb along his wedding ring when he was thinking, an unconscious gesture that made my chest tighten with something that felt like jealousy, but was probably just the ache of being reminded that he had built a life without me, had loved someone else completely and permanently until death made that impossible. But there were familiar things too, gestures and expressions that took me back to the dormitory room we had shared when the world was smaller and every possibility still seemed within reach. The way he would tilt his head when he was considering something carefully. The soft sound he made when he was falling asleep. Not quite a sigh, but something close to it. The way he would absently run his fingers through his hair when he was reading, a habit that had driven our housemaster to distraction during evening study hours. These recognitions hit me at unexpected moments throughout the day, sudden rushes of memory, so vivid they left me breathless. I would be working in my studio, carefully cleaning centuries of grime from the face of a Renaissance saint, and suddenly I would remember the way Andre looked at 17, stretched out on his narrow dorm bed reading Kerouac, with the afternoon sunlight streaming across his bare chest. Or I would be preparing lunch and find myself transported back to the summer we spent at his family's lake house. The two of us standing in the kitchen making sandwiches while his parents slept late, speaking in whispers so we wouldn't disturb the morning quiet. The memories came in waves, each one carrying the particular ache of things that were precious precisely because they were gone. I remembered the night we almost kissed in the art room, working late on a project for our senior exhibition. We had been alone in the building, surrounded by easels and half-finished canvases and the sharp smell of turpentine. Andre had been posing for a portrait I was painting, sitting perfectly still for 20 minutes at a time while I tried to capture the exact shade of his eyes in the late afternoon light. When I finally put down my brush and declared I was finished for the day, he had come to stand behind me, looking over my shoulder at what I had created. His breath was warm against my neck, and when I turned to see his reaction to the painting, our faces were suddenly inches apart. For a moment that lasted either forever or no time at all, we simply looked at each other. His lips were slightly parted, and I could see the pulse beating in his throat. The air between us felt electric, charged with everything we had never said and maybe never would say. I was 17 years old, and I had never kissed anyone, but I knew with absolute certainty that I wanted to kiss Andre Harrison more than I had ever wanted anything in my short life. But then a door slammed somewhere in the building, the sharp sound breaking whatever spell had settled over us. Andre stepped back, clearing his throat and making some comment about how late it was getting, how we should probably clean up and head back to the dorm. The moment dissolved as quickly as it had crystallized, but it left something behind, a knowledge that hummed between us for the rest of that year until graduation scattered us to different colleges and different lives. Now, 23 years later, I found myself thinking about that almost kiss more and more frequently. Lying in bed beside Andre in the blue hour before dawn, I would remember the way he had looked at me in the art room, the way his eyes had moved from mine to my mouth and back again. I wondered if he remembered it too, if that moment lived in his memory with the same clarity and weight it carried in mine. One morning, I woke to find his side of the bed already empty. This had become usual. Andre was an early riser, often up and dressed before I stirred. I could hear the shower running in the bathroom and smell coffee brewing downstairs, evidence of his quiet morning routine that he performed while I slept. I lay in bed for a few extra minutes, savoring the warmth he had left behind in the sheets and the faint scent of his shampoo that clung to his pillow. These were luxuries I had never expected to have again, small intimacies that felt both completely natural and utterly miraculous. When I finally went downstairs, I found Andre in my study instead of the kitchen. He was sitting in the leather chair by the window, but he wasn't reading. Instead, he was holding something in his hands, turning it over with the careful attention he might give to some delicate archaeological artifact. My old sketchbook. I stopped in the doorway, my heart beginning to race. The sketchbook was from our final year at St. Augustine, filled with drawings I had made during those last months when everything between us had become so complicated and fraught. I thought I had hidden it away years ago, tucked it somewhere safe where even I wouldn't stumble across it accidentally. But apparently Andre had found it, had discovered the careful record I had kept of his face during those weeks when I was trying to memorize every detail before we graduated and went our separate ways. Page after page of Andre. Andre laughing at something someone had said in the dining hall. Andre concentrating on a Latin translation. Andre asleep during study hall with his head pillowed on his arms. Andre looking out the dormitory window at something I couldn't see. I had drawn him obsessively that spring, as if I could somehow capture and keep some essential part of him by translating his features into charcoal and graphite. Each sketch was a small act of worship, a way of paying attention to someone I knew I was about to lose. I had drawn his hands, his profile, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he leaned over his desk. I had drawn him in ways that revealed how carefully I had been watching, how much I had memorized about the architecture of his face and the way light moved across his skin. Andre looked up as I approached, his eyes meeting mine with an expression I couldn't read. He didn't say anything about the sketchbook, didn't ask why I had kept it or what it meant that nearly every page contained some version of his face rendered with the kind of attention that could only come from love. Instead, he simply closed the book gently and placed it on the table beside his chair. The gesture was careful, respectful, as if he understood that he had discovered something precious and private, something that deserved to be handled with reverence. Our eyes held for a long moment, and in that silence I felt something shift between us, some final barrier crumbling under the weight of what we had both always known but never acknowledged. The boy I had loved at 17 was looking at me with the eyes of the man he had become, and in those eyes I saw recognition, understanding, and something that might have been relief. We didn't talk about the sketchbook. We went through our usual routine of breakfast and beach walking and quiet conversation. But underneath it all, the air between us had changed. The careful distance we had maintained felt less necessary now, the invisible walls we had built around ourselves beginning to feel more like obstacles than protection. That night, when we climbed into bed, something was different. Andre still turned his back to me, still maintained the careful space we had established, but he seemed closer somehow, as if the discovery of the sketchbook had given him permission to take up slightly more of the territory we shared. I lay on my side, facing his back, close enough to see the gentle rise and fall of his breathing. The rain had started again, drumming against the windows with the insistent rhythm that had become the soundtrack of his visit. In the darkness, I could just make out the line of his shoulder, the curve of his neck where his hair had been freshly cut. Without thinking, without planning, I shifted slightly closer. Not touching, not yet, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. He didn't move away. We lay like that for what felt like hours, breathing in sync, the space between us charged with possibility. And then, so slowly I might have imagined it, Andre shifted backward, closing the distance between us by fractions of inches until I could feel the heat of his body along the length of my chest and legs. Still not touching, but close enough that the air between us felt electric. I moved my hand across the space between us, letting my fingers come to rest near where his hand lay on the mattress. For a moment we stayed like that, our hands inches apart in the darkness, and then I felt the whisper of his fingertips against mine. The touch was so light it might have been accidental, just the natural shift of sleep, but when I didn't pull away, his fingers found mine more deliberately. We didn't interlace our hands, didn't make any grand gesture of connection. We simply let our fingers rest against each other in the darkness, skin against skin for the first time in over 20 years. Neither of us pulled away. I lay awake long after Andre's breathing deepened into sleep, marveling at the simple miracle of that touch. His fingers against mine, warm and slightly rough from yard work and real life, completely different from the smooth boy's hands I remembered, but somehow exactly right. Everything was changing, had been changing since the moment he stepped out of his rental car with that single black suitcase. But this felt like a beginning rather than just another shift in the delicate dance we had been performing around each other. This felt like the first tentative step towards something I had stopped believing was possible. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the salt from the windows and the weariness from the world. And in my bed, in the darkness of my bedroom that smelled like sea air and possibility, Andre slept with his fingers touching mine, both of us finally brave enough to reach across the space that had kept us separate for so long. The storm arrived on our 6th night together, announced by a wind that rattled the windows, and sent the old house creaking like a ship at anchor. I had been watching the weather reports all day, tracking the system as it moved up the coast, but I hadn't mentioned it to Andre. There was something about the approaching darkness that felt appropriate, as if the weather was simply catching up to the electricity that had been building between us since that first touch of fingertips in the dark. The power went out just after 8 o'clock, plunging us into the kind of complete darkness that only happens on the coast, where there are no neighboring houses to soften the blackness with their warm windows. One moment we were sitting in the living room reading, the steady hum of electricity providing its usual background comfort, and the next we were surrounded by silence, so complete it felt like being underwater. I found the flashlight in the kitchen drawer and gathered candles from various rooms, creating small pools of golden light that turned my familiar house into something from another century. Andre helped without being asked, moving around the downstairs rooms with the easy confidence of someone who had learned the geography of my space, lighting candles and closing curtains against the storm that was building its strength outside. We had eaten early, but the candlelight and the drama of the weather made the kitchen feel like the perfect place to linger. I heated soup on the gas stove while Andre arranged the candles on the counter and table, creating an unintentionally romantic atmosphere that neither of us acknowledged directly, but both of us felt. The soup was simple, something from a can that I transformed with fresh herbs and a splash of wine, but it tasted better than it had any right to in the flickering light. We ate standing at the kitchen island, our bowls cupped in our hands, watching the flames dance and listening to the wind gain power outside the windows. The storm was magnificent in its intensity. Rain lashed against the glass and sheets, and the wind howled around the corners of the house with a sound that was both terrifying and oddly comforting. We were warm and dry and together, protected by solid walls and the accumulated weight of 2 centuries of weathering storms just like this one. Andre finished his soup first and set his bowl aside, but he didn't move away from the counter. Instead, he leaned against it, watching me with an expression I couldn't read in the uncertain light. The candlelight softened his features, erasing the lines of grief and exhaustion that had marked his face since his arrival, making him look younger, more like the boy I remembered. The silence between us stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged, expectant, like the air before lightning strikes. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, but inside, in the golden circle of candlelight, we existed in our own separate world. Andre spoke first, his voice quiet but clear above the sound of rain against the windows. "Do you ever think about that night? In school. The art room." The question hit me like a physical blow, sudden and direct after days of careful conversation that avoided anything deeper than the weather or what we planned to have for lunch. I set down my soup bowl with hands that were suddenly unsteady, buying myself a moment to process what he had just asked. I couldn't deny it. Couldn't pretend I didn't know exactly what night he meant. Couldn't claim that the memory hadn't been living in my mind for the past week, surfacing at unexpected moments with the clarity of something that had happened yesterday instead of 23 years ago. "Yes," I said simply. The admission hung between us and the candlelit kitchen, honest and unadorned. There was no point in elaborating, no need to explain that I had thought about that night thousands of times over the years, that it had become the measuring stick against which every other moment of potential intimacy in my life had been found wanting. Andre nodded, as if my answer was what he had expected, what he had hoped for. "I think about it all the time," he said, and his voice carried something that might have been relief. "The way you looked at me. The way I wanted to kiss you so badly I thought I might die from it." His words created a space around us that felt separate from the storm, separate from the house and the years that had passed, and even from the grief that had brought him back to me. In that space, we were 17 again, standing in the art room with turpentine-scented air between us and everything still possible. I moved toward him without conscious decision, drawn by the honesty in his voice and the way the candlelight caught the gold in his hair. He didn't step back. Instead, he reached for me, his hand finding mine with the certainty of someone who had been waiting his entire adult life for permission to make this gesture. What followed wasn't a kiss. though I could see in his eyes that he was thinking about it, that the possibility hung between us like something we could reach for and claim. Instead, it was his hand covering mine, warm and slightly calloused, real in a way that made everything else feel like a dream I was finally waking up from. I caught my breath, a sound that was barely audible but seemed to echo in the quiet space between us. Andre moved closer, close enough that I could smell his shampoo and see the way his pulse beat in his throat, close enough that when he lifted his free hand to touch my face, I could feel the warmth of his palm before it made contact with my skin. The touch was gentle, questioning, his thumb tracing the line of my cheekbone with the reverence of someone handling something precious and fragile. I closed my eyes and leaned into the touch, and when I opened them again, Andre was looking at me with an expression that broke something open in my chest, some dam that had been holding back 23 years of wanting. We fell into each other then, not with the desperate urgency I might have expected, but with a tenderness that spoke to how long we had both been waiting for this moment. His arms came around me, and I buried my face in the curve of his neck, breathing in the scent of him and feeling the solid reality of his body against mine after so many years of dreaming. He held me like I was something valuable he had lost and found again, his hands moving over my back and shoulders with a gentle possessiveness that made me understand, finally, what it meant to be claimed by someone who had known you when you were young and unformed and full of impossible dreams. But even in the midst of that sweetness, Mia was there too. I could feel her presence in the careful way Andre touched me, in the slight hesitation before he allowed himself to pull me closer. She wasn't gone from the room, would never be completely gone from any room Andre entered for the rest of his life. Her absence was part of what had brought him to me, part of what made this moment possible and necessary and complicated in ways that had nothing to do with the two of us and everything to do with the paths our lives had taken in the years when we were apart. I felt Andre's grief in the way he held me, desperate and gentle at the same time, as if I was both an anchor and a lifeline. And I understood that what was happening between us wasn't separate from his loss, but somehow connected to it. That his ability to reach for me now had been carved out by the same pain that had driven him to my doorstep with a single suitcase and eyes that looked like they had seen too much. We stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the candlelit kitchen while the storm raged outside. It wasn't sexual, not exactly, though there was desire underneath the tenderness, want that hummed just beneath the surface of our careful embraces. It was more fundamental than that, more necessary. It was the recognition that we had found each other again after decades of separation, that against all odds and despite all the complications, we were both still here, still capable of this kind of connection. Eventually, we moved to the living room, carrying candles and settling onto the couch with the old quilt my mother had made draped over our shoulders. The storm showed no signs of abating, and without electric lights or television or any of the usual distractions, we existed in a bubble of intimacy that felt both timeless and achingly immediate. Andre sat close enough that our thighs touched, his hand resting on my knee with a casualness that would have been impossible just hours earlier. The candlelight played across his features, and I found myself memorizing this new version of his face, the way grief and middle age had changed him but hadn't diminished the essential qualities that had made me fall in love with him when we were boys. The rain hammered against the windows with relentless intensity, and the wind howled around the corners of the house like something alive and hungry. But inside, wrapped in blankets and surrounded by the warm glow of candles, we were safe and dry and together in a way that felt like a miracle. Andre spoke into the comfortable silence, his voice soft but clear. I should have told you back then. I wanted it too. The words settled between us like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread outward to touch everything we had been to each other and everything we might still become. I felt something shift inside my chest, some frozen place beginning to thaw under the warmth of his confession. I didn't cry, though part of me felt like I might. Instead, I leaned against him more fully, letting my head rest on his shoulder while he stroked my hair with gentle fingers. Outside, The storm continued its assault on the coastline. But inside, something that had been broken for 23 years was finally beginning to heal. We fell asleep on the couch sometime after midnight, wrapped in blankets and each other, the candles burning down to stubs around us. When I woke in the gray light of dawn, Andre was still there, his arms around me and his breathing deep and peaceful in a way I hadn't heard since he arrived. The storm had passed, leaving behind the kind of crystalline morning that follows great upheavals in the weather. The power was still out, but somehow that didn't matter. We had found our way to each other in the darkness, and the light, when it came, would find us changed. I woke to sunlight streaming through the living room windows and the unfamiliar sensation of someone's breathing against my neck. For a moment, I couldn't place where I was or why my back ached from sleeping on the couch, and then memory returned in a rush that made my chest tighten with something between joy and terror. Andre was still asleep, his arm draped across my waist, his face relaxed in a way I hadn't seen since he arrived. The candles had burned down to stubs during the night, leaving waxy pools on the coffee table and side tables, evidence of the storm that had changed everything between us. Outside, the morning was crystalline and still, washed clean by the rain that had battered the coast for hours. I lay motionless, not wanting to disturb him, studying his face in the bright morning light. Sleep had erased the lines of grief and exhaustion that had marked him since Mia's funeral, and for a few precious minutes he looked like the boy I had fallen in love with at 17, peaceful and unguarded, and mine in ways I had never dared to hope for. The power had been restored sometime during the night. I could hear the familiar hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, see the digital clock on the cable box blinking its repetitive 12:00, waiting for someone to reset it to the correct time. The ordinary world had reasserted itself while we slept, but somehow that didn't diminish the magic of what had happened between us in the candlelit darkness. Andre stirred first, his eyes opening slowly, focusing on my face with an expression of mild confusion that quickly shifted to recognition and something softer, something that looked like contentment. He didn't pull away or make excuses about how we had ended up tangled together on my couch. Instead, he tightened his arm around me slightly, as if to confirm that I was real, that the previous night hadn't been some grief-induced hallucination. "Good morning," he said, his voice rough with sleep, but carrying none of the careful distance that had characterized our interactions for the past week. "Good morning," I replied, and felt something settle into place between us, some new understanding that we had crossed a threshold from which there was no returning. We moved through the morning routine differently than we had before. There was a naturalness to our interactions now that hadn't existed when we were still pretending that sharing a bed meant nothing, that the electric tension between us was something we could safely ignore. Andre made coffee while I gathered the spent candles, and when we passed each other in the narrow space between the counter and the island, he touched my waist gently, a casual gesture of affection that sent warmth spreading through my chest. We made breakfast together, not the careful choreography of two people trying to avoid unnecessary contact, but the easy collaboration of a couple who had been sharing kitchen duties for years. Andre cracked eggs while I sliced bread for toast, and when he needed to reach past me for the salt, he let his hand brush against my shoulder, a touch that lingered just long enough to make me understand that it was intentional, wanted, a small claim he was staking on the right to touch me. The quiet that settled between us as we ate was different too, comfortable rather than charged, the silence of two people who no longer needed to fill every moment with careful conversation to avoid acknowledging what was happening between them. Andre sat closer to me at the kitchen table than he had during any of our previous meals, close enough that our knees touched under the table, close enough that I could smell his shampoo and see the fine lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled. And he was smiling more this morning, not the forced politeness he had worn like armor since his arrival, but something genuine and unguarded that transformed his entire face. He looked lighter somehow, as if the confession in the candlelit kitchen had released some weight he had been carrying for decades. We talked about ordinary things. The storm, the damage we could see from the kitchen windows where tree branches had come down during the night, the way the light looked different after rain. But underneath the mundane conversation, there was a new current of intimacy, an awareness that we were no longer two old friends providing each other with temporary comfort, but something else entirely, something that didn't yet have a name, but felt as necessary as breathing. It was just after 10 when the phone rang. The sound was jarring in the peaceful quiet of the morning, an intrusion that made us both freeze. My house phone rarely rang. Most people who needed to reach me used my cell, and the landline existed primarily for emergencies or the occasional telemarketer. But the caller ID showed a Connecticut number I didn't recognize, and Andre's face went pale as he read it over my shoulder. "That's my sister-in-law," he said, and I heard 20 years of marriage in the way he could identify a phone number by sight. 20 years of shared family connections that had nothing to do with me. I handed him the phone and stepped back, giving him privacy while also bracing myself for whatever news would pull him back into the life he had temporarily escaped. Andre answered on the fourth ring, his voice shifting into the careful tone he used when talking to people who knew him primarily as Mia's husband and the father of two grieving children. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes, but I could read the trajectory in Andre's face, in the way his shoulders sagged as he listened to whatever his sister-in-law was telling him. He made appropriate responses, asked gentle questions about logistics and timing, promised things that made it clear he would be leaving soon. When he hung up, we looked at each other across the kitchen, and I felt the careful happiness of the morning begin to crack around the edges. "The kids are asking for me," he said, and his voice carried the weight of obligations that had nothing to do with what we had discovered in the candlelit darkness. "Emma hasn't been sleeping, and Marcus keeps asking when I'm coming home. Sarah thinks it would be good if I came back today." I nodded, though something inside me felt like it was breaking apart. Of course he had to go back. Of course his children needed him, needed the comfort of his presence and the reassurance that he wasn't going to disappear from their lives the way their mother had. I had known from the beginning that his stay was temporary, that he had a real life waiting for him in Connecticut, full of responsibilities and relationships that were more important than whatever was happening between us. But knowing it intellectually and feeling it in my chest were two different things entirely. "I'll help you pack," I said, because it seemed like the right thing to offer, because I wanted to do something useful instead of standing in my kitchen feeling like the world was ending. Andre reached for me then, his hands cupping my face with the same gentle reverence he had shown the night before. "Thank you," he said, but the words carried more weight than a simple acknowledgement of my offer to help. "Thank you for this week. Thank you for letting me fall apart in your house. Thank you for still being exactly who you were when we were 17. We went upstairs together, and I watched him gather his things from around my bedroom, items that had migrated from the guest room over the course of the week until they were integrated into the landscape of my private space. His toothbrush from the bathroom cup, his reading glasses from the nightstand, the paperback novel that had been resting on what I had started thinking of as his pillow. Each object he packed felt like a small loss, evidence being erased of the week when my solitary life had been transformed by his presence. The house would return to its previous quiet, but it would never feel the same. I would never be able to sleep in my bed without remembering the warmth of his body beside me, never make tea in the morning without thinking of how natural it had felt to prepare 2 cups instead of 1. Andre packed slowly, as if he too was reluctant to erase the evidence of our temporary domestic life. When he folded the shirt he had worn the previous evening, the one that had absorbed the scent of candle smoke and the salt air that had blown through the windows during the storm, he held it for a moment longer than necessary before placing it carefully in his suitcase. Finally, there was nothing left to pack. His suitcase sat on my bed, zipped and ready, looking exactly as it had when he arrived except for being slightly more wrinkled from use. Andre sat on the edge of the bed beside it, and I sat next to him, both of us looking at the bag as if it was some kind of accusation. The silence stretched between us, heavy with everything we weren't saying. Outside, I could hear the normal sounds of a morning after a storm. Birds calling to each other from the trees, the distant sound of a neighbor's chainsaw cutting up fallen branches, The ordinary business of life continuing in spite of the fact that everything important had just shifted irrevocably. Andre spoke first, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't know what this means yet," he said, turning to look at me with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "But I know it's not nothing. I know you're not nothing. I know that what happened last night, what's been happening all week, is the most real thing I've felt since Mia died." I felt my throat tighten with emotion I couldn't name, a mixture of gratitude and loss and something that might have been hope. For so many years, I had convinced myself that what I felt for Andre was a boyhood obsession that had grown out of proportion in memory, that the reality of him could never live up to the fantasy I had constructed. But this week had shown me that the opposite was true, that the man he had become was even more compelling than the boy I had loved, more complex and wounded and achingly real. "I waited 20 years, I said carefully, the words coming from some place deeper than conscious thought. "I can wait a little longer." The promise hung between us, fragile and enormous. I didn't know what it meant practically, didn't know how we could navigate the complexities of his grief and his children and the life he had built in Connecticut. But I knew that I meant it, that whatever this was between us was worth waiting for, worth whatever complications lay ahead. Andre turned toward me fully then, his hands finding my face, his thumbs brushing away tears I hadn't realized I was crying. When he kissed me, it was soft and desperate and tasted like salt and coffee and the particular sweetness of something that had been withheld too long finally being offered freely. We held each other for a long time after that, sitting on the edge of my bed with his packed suitcase between us and the late morning lights streaming through the windows. Neither of us spoke about when we might see each other again or how we would stay in contact or what would happen when Andre returned to his regular life and I returned to mine. Those were conversations for another day, logistical problems that would require careful thought and planning. For now, it was enough to hold each other and feel the solid reality of what we had discovered. The knowledge that after 23 years of separation and loss and the careful construction of lives that didn't include each other, we had somehow found our way back to what we should have had all along. When Andre finally pulled away, his eyes were bright with tears, but also with something that looked like peace, as if some question that had been haunting him since we were teenagers had finally been answered. "This isn't ending," he said, and though his words were quiet, they carried the weight of a vow. "This is just beginning." I watched him carry his suitcase down to the front hall, watched him put on his jacket and check his pockets for his keys and wallet, the ordinary rituals of departure that felt surreal after the intimacy of the morning. When he paused at the front door, looking back at me with an expression that tried to memorize my face, I felt something break open in my chest, some dam that had been holding back hope for so long I had forgotten it was there. He would call when he got home safely, he promised. He would figure out how to explain to his children that he needed to maintain a friendship with someone from his past without burdening them with details they weren't ready to understand. He would take things one day at a time and see what became possible as he navigated the complicated geography of grief and desire and the persistent ache of a love that had been interrupted but never truly ended. I stood in my doorway and watched him drive away, his rental car disappearing around the curve in the road that would take him back to the highway, back to Connecticut, back to his real life. The house felt enormous and empty around me, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel lonely. Because this wasn't ending. This was just beginning. The house settled back into silence after Andre left, but it was a different kind of quiet than I had known before. The walls that had contained our week together seemed to hold echoes of conversations and laughter and the particular sound he made when he was falling asleep. Every room carried traces of his presence, invisible to anyone else, but unmistakable to me. I returned to my routines because routine was what had sustained me for years, the careful architecture of solitary days that gave shape to a life lived largely in my own company. Tea at dusk in the blue cup my mother had favored. Classical vinyl on weekend afternoons. Brahms filling the empty spaces with something that resembled companionship. The precise work of restoration in my studio, coaxing beauty back to life one careful stroke at a time. But everything was different now, transformed by the knowledge of what I had briefly possessed and what I might, against all odds, possess again. I left his side of the bed unmade, not intentionally at first, but because when I woke that first morning alone, the sight of the rumpled sheets and the depression his head had left in the pillow felt like the only proof I had that the week hadn't been an elaborate dream constructed by a lonely mind that had finally cracked under the weight of its own longing. His toothbrush remained in the bathroom cup next to mine, a small blue presence that made my morning routine feel less solitary. The paperback novel he had been reading lay open on what I now thought of as his nightstand, bookmarked at page 43, waiting for his return. These small domestic artifacts became talismans, evidence of a life briefly shared and promises that felt too fragile to examine too closely. I worked longer hours in my studio, losing myself in the meticulous process of removing centuries of accumulated grime from a Renaissance Madonna whose face had been hidden beneath layers of misguided restoration attempts. There was something soothing about the precision required, the way problems that seemed insurmountable could be solved through patience and careful attention to detail. Each day brought small revelations as more of the original painting emerged, colors more vivid than I had expected, expressions more nuanced than the darkened surface had suggested. The Madonna's face reminded me of something I couldn't quite name, some quality of serene acceptance that seemed relevant to my current situation. She had waited centuries for someone to see her clearly, to value her enough to undertake the painstaking work of restoration. There was a lesson in that patience, in the faith that what was valuable would eventually be recognized and reclaimed. In the evenings, I found myself drawn to the guest room, standing in the doorway and looking at the bed I had prepared so carefully for André's arrival. The sheets were still turned down exactly as I had left them, the towels still folded in neat stacks on the dresser. He had never slept there, had chosen my bed instead, had chosen proximity over the safety of separate spaces. I left the door open, not for any reason I could articulate, but because closing it felt like giving up on something I wasn't ready to abandon. The letter arrived on a Thursday, 10 days after André had driven away in his rental car. I recognized his handwriting immediately, the careful script he had developed in Catholic school under the watchful eyes of nuns who insisted that penmanship was a reflection of moral character. My name on the envelope looked like a small work of art, each letter formed with the kind of attention that suggested the writing had been as important as the content. I carried the letter to my study before opening it, settling into the leather chair by the window where André had sat when he discovered my sketchbook. The paper was cream-colored and substantial, the kind of stationery that suggested the message inside had been considered carefully before being committed to ink. The letter was brief, but each word felt weighted with meaning. Des, he had written, and seeing the old nickname in his handwriting made something shift in my chest. I thought home was a place, a house, a town, a collection of familiar rooms and comfortable routines. I thought I knew what it meant to belong somewhere. I think it might be you. The children are doing better. Emma is sleeping through the night again, and Marcus has stopped asking when I'm coming back because now he knows I already have. They don't understand yet why I seem happier, but they're young enough to accept it without needing explanations. I dream about your house, about the sound the rain made against the windows and the way the morning light looked in your kitchen. I dream about the weight of your hand in mine and the way you looked at me in the candlelight, like I was someone worth saving. Don't change the sheets. I'll call this weekend when the kids are at their aunt's. There are things we need to figure out, plans we need to make. But for now, I wanted you to know that distance doesn't change anything essential. What we found in your house, what we found in each other, that's real regardless of geography. Wait for me. André. I read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in the drawer of my desk, next to the journal of unsent letters I had been writing to him for 23 years. The contrast was striking, decades of one-sided conversations with someone who lived only in my memory, and now this tangible proof that he was thinking of me, planning for us, believing that what we had discovered was worth the complications it would inevitably bring. That night, I lay in bed with the sheets still rumpled on his side, looking across the room at the guest room door that remained open in the darkness. The house felt less empty than it had since his departure, filled with the promise contained in 3 simple words: wait for me. I could wait. I had been waiting my entire adult life for this, for him, for the possibility that love might be something more than a careful arrangement of solitary habits designed to make loneliness bearable. I had built a life that was sustainable and quiet and safe, but it had never been complete. Now, for the first time since I was 17 years old, completion seemed possible. Outside, the ocean continued its eternal conversation with the shore, waves arriving and retreating in the ancient rhythm that had outlasted empires and would outlast me. But inside, in the darkness of my bedroom, I lay surrounded by evidence of a love that had survived 23 years of separation and seemed strong enough to survive whatever complications lay ahead. The guest room door remained open, a portal to possibilities I was finally brave enough to hope for. And I intended to leave it that way.